Nobody ever dared to tell Tommy Lucchese what to do. Not his soldiers, not his capos, and certainly not the men who sat around him at the commission table. But by early 1966, even Lucchese, the razor-sharp boss with the soft hands and steel nerves, couldn't ignore what was happening to his own body. The headaches came first, then the vomiting, then the seizures. He was losing his balance, his memory, even his sense of time. One afternoon, sitting across from Carlo Gambino, his most trusted friend and ally in the underworld, Tommy slipped up. Forgot something small. Gambino's eyes narrowed. Tommy never forgot. Not names, not dates, not the color of a man's tie before he got whacked. This wasn't right. The doctors told him what Gambino had already guessed. It was brain tumor, inoperable, 3 to 6 months, maybe less. Tommy didn't flinch. He didn't beg. He didn't cry. He'd been around too long for that. This was a man who'd survived the tail end of Prohibition, made his bones in the shadows of Lucky Luciano, and watched the empire of Frank Costello crumble into dust. Tommy Lucchese was old school, loyal to the grave. When Luciano died in Naples, it was Lucchese who stood stunned, broken, mourning the last man he had truly called amico. Now it was his turn. And he knew the vultures would come circling. He didn't want meetings. He didn't want commission votes. He sure as hell didn't want some second-tier capo from another city showing up to talk succession. That wasn't his job. That was Carlo's. And Carlo Gambino, he wasn't just a boss. By 1966, he was the architect. The quiet kingmaker. The man with the patience of a priest and the memory of an undertaker. He'd survived the purge of Masseria, the betrayal of Maranzano, the shakedowns of the Kennedys, and a world war before that. He never served more than a few years in prison. He'd made millions through the Russian stamp scam, ran rackets that stretched from Brooklyn to Havana, and positioned himself, deliberately, quietly, beside every major power broker from Luciano to Anastasia. When Anastasia was buried, Gambino was crowned, and now, as Lucchese faded, another crown sat waiting. In September of that year, the New York cops caught wind of something. A ripple, a gathering of men, bosses, flying in from Tampa, from New Orleans, from corners of Brooklyn and Bronx. Names that lit up FBI files like a Christmas tree: Miranda, Trafficante, Marcello, Colombo, Joe Gallo, Tommy Eboli. They met at La Stella, a quiet Italian joint in Queens. Wine on the table, antipasti on the plates. 13 men, seated with the precision of a State Department banquet. At the head, Mike Miranda, one of Genovese's stand-ins. To his right, Joe Colombo, Tommy Eboli, and a Genovese soldier. To the left, Gambino, Marcello, and Santos Trafficante. On the far end sat the men who made it all run. Agnello Della Croce, Gambino's new underboss. Joe Gallo, soon to be consigliere. Even Anthony Carolla, son of the infamous Silver Dollar Sam. When the cops barged in, they didn't break up a meal. They stepped into a summit. They sketched out the seating chart, arrested all 13 men, and booked them for consorting with known criminals. Bail was set at over $1 million. The next morning, it was paid in full. No collateral, no questions asked. The bosses walked, but the meeting had already served its purpose. According to FBI sources and mob informants, they weren't just talking about old grudges. They were dividing the future. The heroin routes, the union contracts, the political contacts Lucchese still had locked up in his back pocket. Control of Teamsters. Local 295 at Kennedy Airport. The garment trucks that moved 70% of America's clothing. All of it. Up for grabs. Gambino made his move. When Lucchese died the next year, Carlo slid Carmine Tramunti into the chair. Just a figurehead. And ran the family himself. He now controlled 2 of the 5 families outright, and had his fingers deep into a third. When Genovese died in federal prison, the disorganized trio running his family never had a chance. Gambino took that one too, without saying a word. By 1970, he was the boss of bosses. From a back table at La Stella to the head of the American underworld, Carlo Gambino had pulled off something no one had done since Luciano. He didn't need a throne. He already had the kingdom. In the shadowy annals of organized crime, the saga of Carlo Gambino stands as a monumental testament to the enduring allure and perilous power of the Mafia. Don Carlo, Boss of Bosses, penned by Paul Mescal, serves as a linchpin for this gripping documentary, delving deep into Gambino's stealthy ascent within the clandestine corridors of New York's crime families. Alongside this pivotal work, Mafia Dynasty by John Davis, and a cache of invaluable FBI files and press articles, paints a comprehensive portrait of a man whose influence was felt far beyond the visible underworld, from the quiet streets of Rockland County to the tumultuous arenas of national organized crime. This narrative embarks on an exploration similar to past crime narratives, influenced directly by their subjects. Charlie Luciano with his posthumous memoir orchestrated by grieving relatives, Frank Costello's self-narrated rise and fall through legal aids, and Meyer Lansky's storied past as chronicled by Yuri Dan. Now, using Mescal's detailed accounts coupled with the expansive research of Davis, this film seeks to stitch together the complex fabric of Gambino's empire, underpinned by both notorious and obscured events that defined his reign. The journey into Gambino's world begins with an eerie echo of power, as detailed in Mescal's recount of the narcotics trials and mob killings that stained the Bronx and Rockland County, where Gambino, though never physically present, cast a long and ominous shadow. Figures like Vincent Alloy and the tragically fated Manfredi nephews emerge from the pages of Mescal's chronicles, embodying the brutal enforcement and strategic maneuvers that kept Gambino perched at the pinnacle of power. As we weave through these intricately reported events, from the disappearance of Nancy Sue Shelton to the cold-blooded directives that marked Vito Genovese's vendettas, the documentary will endeavor to present a narrative as enthralling and nuanced as the tales spun by Nicholas Pileggi and Selwyn Raab. With each chapter, the story of Carlo Gambino unfolds not just as a biography of a crime lord, but as an epic of an era where law and lawlessness were often indistinguishable. As the chapter of Carlo Gambino, the boss of all bosses, closed with his solemn interment in a marble vault, a new era of uncertainty loomed over New York's criminal landscape. The underworld bid farewell to its paramount leader in a service that was remarkably understated for a man of his notorious stature. This pivotal moment was captured in an article by Joan Nacivera, William Heffernan, and Paul Mescal from the Daily News, detailing the events of Gambino's funeral and the quiet ascendancy of Joseph Nicholas Gallo as the acting head of the Gambino Mafia family. The documentary will draw heavily on these vivid accounts, alongside the foundational narratives provided by Mescal's Don Carlo, Boss of Bosses, and John Davis's Mafia Dynasty. It will explore the intricate web of Gambino's power, his strategic maneuvers within the Mafia's echelons, and the legacy of control he left behind. The death of Gambino not only marked the end of an era, but also set the stage for a precarious transition of power, with Joseph Gallo stepping into the void left by Agnello della Croce's sudden incapacity due to a heart attack. Gallo, a figure who had previously shunned the limelight, was thrust into a role that few outside the Mafia's inner circles could have predicted. His only criminal conviction back in 1946 seemed trivial compared to the responsibilities he would assume. This narrative will delve into the Little Appalachian Meeting, an event scarcely known yet pivotal, where Gallo's presence alongside the most formidable figures of the Mafia, like Carlos Marcello and Santo Trafficante, hinted at his understated yet critical role within the Gambino family. The documentary will stitch these elements together, using the church service at Our Lady of Grace as a focal point to underscore the duality of Gambino's life. Revered by his kin and allies, yet a figure of contention to the law and the public. The procession from the Cusimano and Russo funeral home to the discreet gathering of mourners at St. John's Cemetery encapsulates the secretive yet public fascination with the Mafia's operations, ensuring that Carlo Gambino's legacy is portrayed with the depth and complexity it commands. To be born in Palermo was to be born into the shadow and the heart of the Mafia. It was not just an organization, it was the air the people breathed, the invisible hand that ruled the island with a quiet, relentless grip. For centuries, it had been the true power in Sicily, governing where the state had failed. By the time Carlo Gambino entered the world in the year 1902, the Mafia had reached its zenith. It dictated rents and wages, controlled factories and farmlands, and commanded a loyalty so deeply that the police dared not set foot in certain districts without permission. Carlo was born into a world where the honored society was not seen as a band of criminals, but as a fraternity of protectors, men who upheld tradition, who settled disputes with steel and silence, who exacted tribute in exchange for the kind of justice the state could not, or would not, provide. It was not a question of whether one would be part of it, but of how high one could rise. His mother was a Castellano, from a family deeply intertwined with the old ways. His father's name carried weight in Palermo's underground. The Gambinos and the Castellanos were not destitute peasants, toiling under the weight of feudal landlords. They were respected, connected. The kind of people who understood the rules of power in a land where the law was just a suggestion. The tales Carlo grew up on were not fairy tales. They were blood-stained legends, whispered in hushed voices in candle-lit rooms, the stories of men who had bent history to their will. His favorite was the story of the Sicilian Vespers, a rebellion in 1282 that saw thousands of Sicilians rise up against their French occupiers, slaughtering them in the streets, their cries of Morte alla Francia, Italia Annela giving birth to a legend. Some said that was when the Mafia was born, a brotherhood forged in blood, its roots stretching back centuries, long before the island had seen the likes of Garibaldi or Mussolini. But the figure who truly captivated young Carlo, the man he secretly vowed to become, was Don Vito Cascio Ferro, the uncrowned king of Sicily. To outsiders, he was a criminal, a fugitive who had fled America after extorting hard-earned dollars from Italian immigrants. To the people of Palermo, he was a monarch in his own right, a man who could make or break fortunes with a word. The aristocrats, the bankers, the judges, they all sought his favor. Even the poorest of the poor saw him as a kind of Sicilian Santa Claus, a man who rode through the streets in a gilded carriage on All Souls' Eve, handing out sweets to children. But nothing in Palermo came without a price. Carlo watched. He learned. He absorbed the way men of power walked through the streets, how their very presence commanded respect. Men tipped their hats. Women curtsied. The police looked the other way. He was just a boy, but he already knew. One day, he would be like them. He would not be a merchant or a farmer or a peasant laboring for scraps. He would be a man of respect. By the time he was a teenager, the honored society had become the only government that mattered in western Sicily. It had moved beyond extortion and racketeering. It had become the force that controlled everything. The landlords, the businesses, the politicians, all of them answered to the men of honor. There was no escaping their grip. Even the Camorra of Naples, which had once held sway over southern Italy, could not match the speed and efficiency with which the Mafia had tightened its hold on Sicily. But the island was a prison, as much as it was a kingdom. Ambitious men had limited room to maneuver. For every Don Vito Cascio Ferro, there were 100 other men, hungry for power, willing to slit a throat for a seat at the table. Carlo Gambino learned early that power came in two forms, the kind the state pretended to hold and the kind that ruled the streets. Palermo was a city where history hung heavy in the air, where thousands of years of conquest had left its people distrustful of any authority that did not come from within. The police, the government, the law, they were all foreign intrusions, forces to be ignored, circumvented, or when necessary, eliminated. The real power belonged to the men of respect, men who didn't need uniforms or government titles, men who walked the piazzas in fine suits and had their hands kissed in the streets. The state's justice was slow, corrupt, and ineffective. The Mafia's justice was swift and absolute. To a boy growing up in Palermo, the honored society wasn't just a criminal enterprise. It was destiny. And then, in March of 1909, the Mafia reminded the world just how powerful it was. He died in the shadows of the old world, but the tremors of his death tore through the new. Lieutenant Joseph Petrosino, a bulldog in a bowler hat, wasn't just gunned down in a Palermo alley on March 12, 1909. He was executed, silenced, marked for death, not because he made mistakes, but because he didn't. By the time the month began, the newspapers were already whispering about his newest mission under headlines buried beneath weather forecasts and local gossip. Petrosino's new job, the Daily Record called it. But this wasn't a job. It was a declaration of war. A secret assignment meant to decapitate the Black Hand and break the Mafia's grip on America before it strangled the immigrant dream. Petrosino wasn't a man to be coddled by press agents or protected by politicians. He walked into danger like a prizefighter stepping into the ring, eyes forward, fists clenched. His strategy was bold. Build a living index of Italian cafes in New York. Those smoke-filled rooms where vendettas were whispered over espresso, and blood was spilled as often as wine. These cafes weren't just social joints. They were incubators, breeding grounds for violence, extortion, and fear. And Petrosino was determined to snuff them out. But his ambitions reached farther than Little Italy. The New York Post revealed that Petrosino had sailed to Sicily under a cloud of secrecy. His purpose? Twofold: to coordinate with Italian police and to cut off the Mafia's Atlantic escape route. He wanted to shut every door they had. He knew the risk, but he believed in the mission, and maybe in his own invincibility. 4 years earlier, in a murder case in Van Cortlandt Park, he'd unraveled the mystery from a smudged slip of paper no bigger than a matchbox. That was Petrosino, a detective who saw patterns in the dust. The kind of man criminals feared because he couldn't be bought, bullied, or bluffed. But Sicily was different. Sicily was home turf to the men he hunted. And in Palermo, Petrosino became the hunted. The press painted his heroism in broad strokes. His innovation, his resolve, his charisma. But in doing so, they also painted a target on his back. He wasn't just chasing ghosts anymore. He was challenging a power structure that had lasted for centuries, hidden behind olive groves and stone walls, and enforced with bullets. On the night of March 12th, as he stepped out into the dim streetlight, it wasn't justice that he met him. It was vengeance. 3 shots rang out, then silence. Just the sound of his body hitting the cobblestones. No backup, no last words. The Mafia didn't just kill a cop, they made a statement. News of his death ricocheted across continents. Palermo to New York, Rome to Washington. Shock turned to outrage. In America, his death wasn't seen as a failed mission. It was a spark, a call to arms. The next morning, headlines screamed. The day confirmed it through special dispatch. Petrosino had been struck down in the line of duty, a martyr to a cause few dared take up. The Philadelphia Inquirer gave the details in chilling sequence. A tramway station, 4 gunshots, his revolver half drawn. It was over in seconds, but the consequences would last decades. Within hours, America responded. Deputy Commissioner Woods called for war. Petrosino's death wouldn't go unanswered. From New York to Chicago, from San Francisco to New Orleans, Italian crime syndicates were put on notice. The crackdown had begun. Even Roosevelt, who knew Petrosino personally, mourned the loss. He called him brave, invaluable, a man who could have had a desk job but chose the battlefield instead. But while America mourned, the real war ignited behind the scenes. Palermo police scrambled to save face. Suspects were rounded up. Secrets guarded. The fear was real, not just of the Mafia, but of what they might have stolen. Petrosino's documents, his notes, his plans, might now be in enemy hands. Inspector McCafferty feared a breach that could unravel years of work. March 16th, Palermo. A man named Palazzotto, a known Camorra associate previously deported by Petrosino, was arrested. He had sworn revenge. But no one believed it was just personal. This wasn't a grudge kill, it was a sanctioned hit, a message. McCafferty launched raids across Brooklyn. Dozens arrested, warrants signed without hesitation. This was bigger than justice, it was retaliation. And the gloves were off. Rome responded with power. Unlimited funds. A new inspector general, empowered to crush the conspiracy. Even the American consul was threatened. One shipping agent refused to handle Petrosino's body after receiving death threats. The Mafia wasn't hiding anymore. It was roaring. By March 19th, a worldwide manhunt was underway for Giuseppe De Primo. Another ex-con, Petrosino, had deported. Another name on the list. Another ghost in the Sicilian fog. But as the weeks passed, frustration mounted. The Sicilian authorities moved too slowly, too cautiously. The public wanted blood, justice, retaliation. A reward was offered. Eyes turned to the alleys of Palermo and the docks of New York. But this was no longer about one man. It was about what he stood for. Lieutenant Joseph Petrosino didn't just die fighting the Mafia. He became the first fallen soldier in a war that had just begun. In Palermo, the killing of Lieutenant Joseph Petrosino only cemented Don Vito's legend. He didn't just order the hit, he boasted about it. He even claimed to have been driven to and from the murder scene in the private carriage of a sitting member of Parliament, a man who swore under oath that Don Vito had been at home that evening. The message was clear. The Mafia did as it pleased. Young Carlo Gambino and his schoolmates made a special pilgrimage to the Piazza Marina to see the exact spot where history had been made. The killing of a New York police detective on Sicilian soil was more than just an execution. It was a statement of power. The Sicilian Mafia did not answer anyone. And if America had a problem with that, Sicily didn't care. It could go to hell. 3 years after the assassination of Joseph Petrosino sent shockwaves through the underworld, Sicily made a bold move. Universal suffrage. Every man, no matter his wealth or title, was granted the right to vote. It was a seismic shift. Great Britain wouldn't do the same until 1928. In America, the fight for that kind of equality would drag on for decades. But this wasn't a world ruled by countries anymore, it was ruled by empires. And those empires were bleeding. In 1911, Italy picked a fight with the crumbling Ottoman Empire. The war over Libya began with bombs dropped from primitive aircraft and ended with a signature on a treaty in 1912. But beneath the politics and military maneuvers, something bigger was unraveling. The old order. The world that young Carlo Gambino was born into, this sun-scorched, blood-soaked corner of Sicily, was mutating by the minute. Borders were redrawn, empires fell, armies modernized, and men like Gambino were watching, learning. Change moved fast, like technology today. One invention replaced the next. One government toppled another. Gambino's world didn't shift slowly. It jolted forward in violent bursts, the same way a gunshot breaks the silence of an alley. But before he crossed the Atlantic, he stayed in Sicily just long enough to learn its unwritten laws. How power moved in shadows, how loyalty was sacred, and how a whisper in a village square could travel further than any bullet. That was the world that made him, and he never forgot it. But elections weren't determined by free will. Peasants were bribed, threatened, or beaten into backing candidates handpicked by the Mafia. Bullets had their place, but ballots could be just as effective. The honored society had moved beyond brute force. They were now a political machine. No one outside the Mafia would ever know the exact date that Carlo Gambino took the oath. His life was a maze of shadows, carefully designed to leave no trace. But those who later investigated him believed he became a man of respect before he ever left Sicily. The ceremony hadn't changed in generations. In Sicily, where myth and memory blurred into one, the Mafia had grown so powerful that it no longer stood beside religion. It became religion. In Palermo, the line between faith and organized crime was no line at all. When a man was chosen to be made to enter the inner sanctum of Cosa Nostra, it wasn't just a ritual. It was a sacrament. It began in the open, under the Sicilian sun. The Madonna della Montagna would be carried through the cobbled streets, surrounded by music, incense, and whispered reverence. To outsiders, it looked like a festival. To those who knew better, it was a signal. A new soldier was about to take the oath. A new guardian of Sicily was being born. The Madonna wasn't just a symbol of purity. In this world, she was also a witness to blood, to silence, to the code. The parade was for show. The true ceremony happened in the shadows. A darkened room. Heavy silence. The scent of wax and old wood. A long table, worn smooth from years of whispered judgments, surrounded by men in black suits. Their faces were carved from stone, expressionless, eyes heavy with generations of secrets. At the center of the table, a candle, a dagger, a revolver, and a small paper image of a saint, soon to be stained with blood. This was the moment young Carlo Gambino had been brought to. Through his Castellano relatives, word had spread. He was the right kind of young, quiet, cold, watchful, born with the bloodline and shaped by the times. He didn't talk too much, didn't ask too many questions. 5'7", lean and slight, but still, when he entered a room, people moved. He sat still as stone. The candle flame danced in his eyes, casting long shadows across his face. His jet-black hair was neatly combed, his sharp nose angled downward, but those eyes, they didn't blink. They read everything. Everyone. A smile flickered at the corners of his lips, small and unreadable, the kind of smile that could mean nothing or everything. One of the men leaned forward and pricked Carlo's finger. A drop of blood slid down and splashed onto the saint's image. Smoke curled from the candle as the oath was spoken. Loyalty, secrecy, brotherhood, until death. Carlo Gambino didn't flinch. He had arrived. The paper was set aflame, and he cupped the burning scrap in his hands, repeating the sacred vow. "This is the way I will burn if I betray the brotherhood." There was no hesitation, no fear. He was now bound to something older and stronger than any government. Then came the First World War. Carlo Gambino was lucky, just a young teenager when the blood started spilling. Too young to hold a rifle, too connected to be caught in the middle of the chaos. But war has a way of touching everything, even the untouchable. Sicily changed. The old men were shipped off to the front lines, or worse, fled. Some ran to America, trading their uniforms for overcoats and new identities. And in that vacuum of power, a quiet teenager from Palermo started carving out his own little kingdom. While the world burned, Gambino learned. He moved quietly, stayed useful, and made sure the bosses kept eating while the rest of the country starved. In war, there's always loss, but for men like Carlo, there's also gain. Smuggling became a new religion. With the right product and the right connections, borders didn't matter. And Gambino, he always found the right door. When the war ended, the smoke cleared to reveal a shattered Sicily. Economic collapse. Widespread hunger. Entire villages were ghost towns. Gambino lived it. He breathed in the misery of the streets while his future partners, Costello with his raspy charm, Luciano dodging service with a well-placed infection, Lansky and Siegel still too young to be called, watched it all from across the Atlantic. Carlo saw the real thing. The veterans came back hollow-eyed and bitter. There were no parades, no pensions, no place for them in the world they'd left behind, and that rage had to go somewhere. So it went into the streets. It wasn't just Sicily. Italy itself was fracturing. As the government weakened, the Mafia stepped in. What was once a whisper in the shadows became a roar. Crime became structure, power, survival. The Banda di Onore was no longer just tradition. It was the only ladder out of hell. Looting, extortion, black market everything. And Carlo Gambino, still a teenager, was already making money from it. The war didn't end in 1918, not for the Sicilians. It morphed into something uglier, civil unrest, dignity stripped, families ruined. These were proud men, descendants of Rome, staring at crumbling ruins and empty promises. Workers rioted. Students fought in the streets. Bullets replaced ballots. In Italy, politics wasn't a debate. It was a gunfight. It was the perfect storm. Returning soldiers wanted land, reform, the future they were promised in the trenches. They got nothing. That frustration fed the Mafia like gasoline. Among Sicily's poor, organized crime wasn't just an option, it was a necessity. And Gambino, always 3 moves ahead, rode the wave. At the same time, America was swelling with new arrivals. Human cargo. Masseria and Maranzano weren't just gangsters, they were traffickers, smugglers of the desperate. Shipping poor Italians across the ocean and throwing them into labor rackets. Luciano hated it, said it was slavery with a new name. But during the Great Depression, even he opened the floodgates again. You take what the times give you. Back in Sicily, things kept getting worse. Hunger turned into hate. People needed a villain. And the old scapegoats resurfaced. Anyone with a Jewish name, Jewish face, Jewish business. Gangsters, bankers. It didn't matter. If you were Jewish, you were blamed. For the war, for the poverty, for everything. Then came the voice, rising from the static, growing louder with every speech, every poster, every clenched fist in the piazza. Mussolini. His promises were seductive, brutal, nationalistic. And as he rose, so did the fear. A second wave of immigration swept across the sea. This time it wasn't just the poor. It was anyone who could see the storm coming. Among them was a young man named Carlo Gambino. But before he left, he saw the storm break open. He saw Mussolini rise, and he knew Italy was finished. By 1920, Palermo felt like a tomb. The streets were still lined with monuments to long-dead kings, conquerors and emperors, Greek urns, Roman statues, Arab minarets, Norman cathedrals, Spanish palaces. Every inch of the city was a reminder of the past, of men who had ruled and been ruled in an endless cycle of conquest. For some, this history was a source of pride. For others, it was suffocating. The young men of Gambino's generation didn't want to live in a museum. And then there was Mussolini. The fascists had declared war on the Mafia, sending in iron-fisted prosecutors with orders to break the organization at any cost. Raids, arrests, public executions. The old ways were under attack, and the men who had ruled from the shadows were being dragged into the light. Carlo was barely 20, but he saw the writing on the wall. If he wanted to make something of himself, it would not be in Palermo. He had heard the stories of the men who had crossed the ocean and remade themselves in America. Men like Ferro, who had gone to New York and built fortunes from nothing. The land of opportunity was not a dream. It was a strategy. And so, as another ship full of hopeful immigrants set sail for the New World, Carlo Gambino was on board, leaving behind the ancient streets of Palermo, the cobbled alleys where he had first seen men of honor walk with untouchable confidence. He was not running. He was advancing. Sicily had taught him the rules. Carlo Gambino had been marked for the honored society since he was a teenager. He had the right blood, the right temperament, and a quiet, watchful demeanor that made older men take notice. He was not a thug, nor was he one for reckless violence. Some wondered if he had the stomach to kill, but no one doubted his ability to obey. And in the Mafia, obedience mattered more than anything. The timing of Carlo Gambino's departure from Sicily was no accident. The First World War had ended, leaving jobs scarce and fewer opportunities. The dons who ruled the island made millions off the suffering of others, but their young foot soldiers, they were left to fight for scraps. The real money, the real power, was across the Atlantic. And there was another threat. Benito Mussolini and his black-shirt enforcers were tightening their grip on Italy, vowing to crush the Mafia once and for all. Il Duce's war against the Sicilian underworld was already underway, with mass arrests, police raids, and public trials meant to humiliate the men who had ruled the island for generations. Those who could see the writing on the wall fled before the noose tightened. Gambino had always lived close to the edge. Even as a teenager, the streets of Palermo had already shaped him into something lethal. Born in 1902, by the time he was 18, he wasn't some petty thief trying to make a name. He already had one. He likely had blood on his hands, and a reputation that carried weight in the criminal underworld. He moved like someone who understood power. And in Mussolini's Italy, that made him a marked man. The fascists weren't just cracking down, they were choking Sicily. Mussolini's regime didn't just target enemies of the state. It targeted the old codes, the quiet handshakes, the shadow empires that had ruled for generations. Gambino wasn't just at risk, he was doomed. The noose was tightening, and it was only a matter of time before someone slipped it around his neck. He had one option: escape. The politics of Italy were shifting into something brutal and irreversible, and no one could stop the wave that was about to crash over the country. The only thing that would kill it was war, another one. The Second World War was still on the horizon, but it would come, and when it ended, Gambino wouldn't be some refugee or forgotten street tough. He would be a multimillionaire in America. That was less than 20 years away. But first he had to leave. Fortunately, fate, or family, had a plan. His mother reached out across the Atlantic. There were cousins already in the United States, the Castellanos. They had built something in the New World: meat businesses, trucking contracts. They needed someone to protect it, to enforce, to operate. Someone who could move product, keep outsiders at bay, and make sure nobody got any ideas. But Gambino wasn't just muscle. That's what made him different. He had the patience of a priest and the instincts of a wolf. He knew when to speak, when to strike, and, more importantly, when not to. In America, that intelligence would be his greatest weapon. And soon, the streets of New York would become his proving ground. As Carlo Gambino waved goodbye to his mother in Palermo, the gravity of the moment weighed heavily on him. His departure was not just a journey to a new land. It was an escape, a mission driven by necessity rather than choice. Unlike other immigrant families who carried dreams of prosperity and education for their children in America's free society, The Gambinos were compelled by the harsh realities of their entrenchment in Sicily's criminal networks. America presented a sanctuary, a new battleground where Carlo could extend his influence without the overbearing scrutiny of Sicilian authorities. Carlo was already a respected figure in Palermo, known for his decisiveness and feared for his role as a triggerman. His family's deep roots in the criminal underworld had molded him into a formidable figure. This reputation made his transition to America less about starting anew and more about expanding his reach. The American dream for Carlo was tinted with the darker hues of power and survival, rather than the bright promise of liberty and opportunity. Upon his arrival, the connections his family had cultivated proved invaluable. The Castellano crime family in New York, already a prominent force, was alerted to the potential of this young, astute Sicilian. The Gambinos had communicated Carlo's capabilities and loyalty, setting the stage for his integration into their operations. This was a calculated move, ensuring that Carlo would not land as a mere foot soldier, but as someone earmarked for greater responsibilities. Carlo's integration into the Castellano family was rapid and effective. Within 5 years, his alliance was solidified through marriage to Catherine Castellano, tying familial and criminal bonds that would fortify his position within the New York Mafia. This union was not just a marital alliance, but a strategic consolidation of power, influence, and mutual interests between two powerful families. This period marked the transformation of the American Mafia from a collection of street gangs into a structured, formidable entity. Figures like Carlo Gambino, Charlie Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and Frank Costello didn't just adapt to the ways of New York. They shaped them. They utilized their old-world cunning and ruthlessness, honed through years of survival in Sicily's cutthroat environment, to carve out empires in the burgeoning underworld of Prohibition-era America. For Carlo Gambino, the goodbye to his mother was a pivotal moment, a commitment that the sacrifice would be worth it. He was not fleeing to America. He was advancing, armed with the knowledge and skills from Sicily, ready to redefine the Mafia's future on a new stage, where the stakes were as high as the rewards were lucrative. He left Palermo in the dead of night, smuggled aboard the freighter SS Vincenzo Florio, bound for Norfolk, Virginia. The ship's captain had been paid well to look the other way, and the crew understood that the Sicilian stranger in their midst was not someone to ask questions about. He was 21 years old, stocky, standing just 5'7", with thick black hair, sharp dark eyes, and a nose like an eagle's beak. Not handsome, but striking. His presence alone gave the impression of warmth and sincerity, an impression that often led men to underestimate him. Beneath the charm lay something colder. Gambino was no brute. He was patient, cunning, a man who played the long game. The 1920s didn't creep in quietly. They exploded, like a gunshot in a crowded speakeasy. Prohibition hit America like a sledgehammer, and the rules changed overnight. Anyone not ready to swim with the tide of bootleg liquor was about to get a bullet in the back of the head. This wasn't business as usual. It was evolution by fire. You either adapted or you got buried. Old alliances cracked, new ones formed. The Irish, the Jews, the Italians, everyone was reaching for a bigger piece of the pie, and nobody was waiting politely. The old world was colliding with the new, and the first casualty of this underworld revolution was a man who thought he could hold back the flood. His name was Big Jim Colosimo. In Chicago, Big Jim was royalty. He built an empire out of vice, crime, and charm, and he wore it all like a crown. Diamond stickpins, white linen suits, fine food, opera, and ragtime. His restaurant on Wabash Avenue wasn't just a hot spot, it was a palace. Politicians, socialites, mobsters, and musicians all rubbed elbows at Colosimo's. A 6-course meal cost $1.50 and came with a front-row seat to the spectacle of high society flirting with the underworld. They called him Diamond Jim for a reason. But Colosimo got comfortable. Too comfortable. He had climbed the ranks the old way, pickpocketing in Chicago's First Ward, marrying a madam named Victoria Moresco, and expanding a brothel empire that, at its peak, controlled more than 200 houses of prostitution. He had money, power, respect. But times were changing, and Colosimo didn't want to change with them. Back in 1909, when the Black Hand tried to shake him down with the same kind of extortion racket he'd once used himself, Colosimo didn't flinch. He played the game. He understood the rules. But even a man like Jim knew there were some threats you couldn't ignore. That's when he brought in muscle from New York Sharp, calculating torpedo named Johnny Torrio. Torrio handled the Black Hand the way only men like him could, permanently. Torrio stayed in Chicago, became Big Jim's right hand, and soon Torrio brought in someone else, another quiet operator from Brooklyn. His name was Al Capone. By 1920, Colosimo was aging into his empire like a man slipping into a velvet robe. He divorced Victoria, married a young soprano named Dale Winter, and spent more time dining and whining than plotting and climbing. He thought the world would wait for him. But Torrio saw the future, and it came bottled in bootleg liquor. Prohibition was here, and it was a gold mine. Torrio wanted to go in. Colosimo didn't, and that was his mistake. On May 11th, 1920, Big Jim walked into his restaurant to handle a shipment of whiskey. Maybe he thought he still had the final say. Maybe he thought Chicago still belonged to him. But someone else had made a decision. A gunman was waiting. Colosimo collapsed on the tiled floor of his own restaurant lobby, shot dead before he even saw it coming. No one was arrested. No one talked. But the whispers pointed to Frankie Yale, flown in from New York, acting on orders from Johnny Torrio. Whether it was Frankie who pulled the trigger, or not, one thing was clear. Big Jim was out, and the future had just walked through the door. Colosimo's funeral was a spectacle, an opulent send-off fit for a fallen king. The cortege rolled through Chicago's streets, taking him past the restaurant one last time. Mourners packed the sidewalks. Some cried, some stared. All knew they were watching the end of an era. Diamond Jim was buried in a grand mausoleum in Oakwood Cemetery. The outfit buried him with the old rules. And just like that, the door to Prohibition was kicked wide open. By 1921, New York was a different city, especially for the Italian-American underworld. The old immigrant enclaves were shifting, and so were the power lines between gangs. When Frank Costello first stepped off the boat with his older brother, they fought tooth and nail in the streets. Italians against Irish, Irish against Jews, everybody clawing for a foothold. Ironically, it would be Costello who later slipped into the halls of political power, carrying an Irish name and cutting deals with the very people he used to brawl against. He was born Francesco Castiglia, but in the age of votes and booze, Costello opened more doors. Charlie Luciano couldn't quite play that same game, not yet. He was still young, still paying his dues. He had already done time for truancy in Brooklyn and caught a stretch for narcotics possession. A year in the workhouse that sharpened him more than it broke him. By 1923, Luciano was arrested again, caught up once more in the drug racket. But this time he wasn't a street kid with a big mouth. He had a crew, a real one. And within that circle was a rising star. Joe Adonis. Adonis wasn't just muscle. He was plugged into the narcotics pipeline and neck-deep in politics. His alliance with Waxy Gordon gave him reach across the country. Adonis was becoming a Prohibition powerhouse, and he brought that fire straight into Luciano's corner. The same could be said for Benny Siegel and Meyer Lansky, the Jewish duo behind the Bugs and Meyer mob. They were still kids, but already moving liquor and muscle for Arnold Rothstein, the man who ran Midtown with a banker's brain and a killer's smile. Luciano's team was evolving, Italian, Jewish, a new hybrid of organized crime. And they weren't just running booze. They were proving loyalty, the old way. Enter Umberto Valenti. Valenti had a name soaked in blood. The press said he was responsible for more bodies than any man in New York, and for once they might not have been exaggerating. A Sicilian-born killer tied to Salvatore d'Aquila, Valenti had made his bones in the dying days of the Morello mob. When Morello went to prison, his empire splintered. The Terranova brothers and Joe Masseria tried to fill the vacuum, but Valenti played his own game. In 1920, the criminal chessboard shifted again. Morello and Masseria walked free. D'Aquila, already head of a rival faction, saw the danger and moved fast. He needed to know where Valenti's loyalties lay. So he gave him a test. Kill the old guard, Masseria, Morello, and anyone else who could threaten the throne. Valenti struck first. On May 7, 1922, he gunned down Vincent Terranova and Silva Tagliagamba, two bosses from the Morello camp. It was a clean job, but when he came for Masseria, the job unraveled. Masseria didn't die. In fact, he danced through the bullets. On May 8th, Valenti tried again, broad daylight, middle of the street. Shots were fired, chaos erupted, civilians screamed. No mobsters hit, but the streets ran with innocent blood. The next day, May 9th, he made another attempt. Two gunmen opened fire as Masseria stepped out of his home. The bullets sliced through the air, clipped his hat, but Masseria moved like a prizefighter, dodging, weaving, ducking for cover. The shooters took off, blowing through a crowd of union workers. Two civilians were killed. Masseria. Still breathing, Valenti's credibility was crumbling, and Masseria's legend was growing. Then came the trap. On August 11th, 1922, Valenti was summoned to a sit-down on 12th Street. Masseria promised peace. Valenti believed it, or at least pretended to. But when he stepped onto the street, hat in hand, the air changed. It was an ambush. He turned to run, sprinting toward a taxi. That's when the bullets found him. They weren't just there for the kill, they were there to prove themselves, and they proved it with gunpowder and blood. The aftermath was chaos. Civilians caught in the crossfire. A street cleaner named Joseph Shepis shot through the throat. A little girl, Agnes Egliger, struck in the chest as she walked with her parents. News reports chalked it up to a bootlegger's feud, but it was more than that. It was a change of the guard. Valenti died in St. Mark's Hospital. His reputation died with him. A teenage witness swore one of the shooters stood out, calm, precise, like he'd done it 100 times. That shooter, the kid claimed, was Salvatore Luciano. And beside him, another future titan, Vito Genovese. It sounded like the kind of moment that would echo through underworld history. Two young killers, side by side, gunning down Umberto Valenti in the heart of Manhattan. A murder that cleared the path for Joe Masseria's rise, and by extension their own. But when you dig through the stories, the court records, the memoirs from men who lived through it all, something doesn't add up. There's no clear testimony, no hard confirmation. Not from Doc Stacher, not from Meyer Lansky, not from Frank Costello. Not even a passing mention in the memoirs of old Jewish gangsters, many of whom recounted every bullet, every betrayal, every blood-soaked night they ever lived through with Luciano. And yet, this one? Silence. The story lingers in the shadows, whispers, hints, but not proof. And maybe that's the most telling thing of all. Because if it had been Luciano, if Lucky had been the one to squeeze the trigger in that chaotic street corner ambush, if his bullets had found Valenti's heart, someone, somewhere, would have made sure his name was written in blood and glory. But the silence around it, that suggests something else. Maybe he was there, maybe he wasn't. Maybe the story got better with time. But what did happen that day was more important than who pulled the trigger. Luciano and Genovese walked away with something far more valuable than turf or street cred. They walked away with Masseria's trust. And in their world, that was the currency that mattered. Luciano was always watching, always absorbing. Not just the moves, but the meaning behind them. From the chaos of Lower Manhattan to the quiet rooms where deals were made with cigars and nods, he was learning. Learning from the boss, from the streets. But most of all, from a man who wasn't a killer, but something far more dangerous. Arnold Rothstein. The Jewish fixer who played poker with bankers, bribed judges with one hand, and moved heroin with the other. A man with Wall Street eyes and a diamond-hard heart. Rothstein didn't just teach Luciano how to make money, he taught him how to think. And lucky Luciano was learning. Not just how to kill, but how to rule. And so, in the cold dark of November 1921, Carlo Gambino, 21 years old and already wise beyond his years, was smuggled aboard the SS Vincenzo Florio like contraband. Hidden in the cargo hold, packed between crates and machinery, he wasn't just escaping poverty, he was walking into history. The ship was bound for Virginia, and Gambino knew what waited on the other side wasn't freedom. It was obligation. When the freighter docked in Norfolk, the docks were slick with winter fog. The air stung like a blade. On December 23, 1921, Gambino stepped onto American soil for the first time in a brand new suit that didn't fit quite right, the fabric stiff and untested. Just like him. Christmas lights flickered along the wharf, blinking from dim cafes and sailor bars, but Carlo barely noticed. He hadn't crossed an ocean to celebrate. He came to build, to climb. At the end of the dock, a car idled beneath the low beam of a street lamp. The headlights flashed once. Gambino walked toward it. Inside was a face he hadn't seen in years, a Castellano cousin, older, broader, with the same dark Sicilian eyes. They embraced in silence, 2 kisses to the cheek, no words. None needed. They got in, and the car rolled north. New York was a different kind of beast, a jungle of stone and steel where everything moved fast and nothing came easy. Men clawed for what they could get, on the factory floors, in the unions, in the offices, in the rackets. Carlo Gambino didn't come for a wage. He came for control. He settled in Brooklyn on Navy Street, a stretch of road littered with sailors, hustlers, prostitutes, and corpses. It was a neighborhood where everyone had a side hustle, and the sidewalk could eat you alive. The police didn't ask questions. The neighbors didn't speak. If a man was face down on the curb, you stepped over him. That was the law of the street. But Gambino wasn't some wide-eyed immigrant with a suitcase full of hope. He wasn't alone. He had 2 families waiting, his own blood and La Cosa Nostra. His first cousins, Peter and Paul Castellano, were already in business, running a modest trucking company with deep ties to the right people. They gave him work, nothing flashy but steady. Another cousin, Thomas Masotto, became his closest ally. They were more than kin. They were a crew. Gambino understood the rules immediately. You didn't complain. You didn't ask questions. You listened. You learned. And when the time came, you delivered. Every job, no matter how small, was a test. A chance to prove you could handle it. He handled it all. His uncle had married into the Masotto family, a name that carried weight in the honored society. The Castellanos were already making money, already linked in with the American branches of the old Sicilian network. The system was in place. A machine of blood and silence, built to move young talent from the old country to the new world. Through the years, these cousins would remain constants in Gambino's rise, backing his ventures, laundering his money, and helping him expand into legitimate and not-so-legitimate corners of business. And for their loyalty, Gambino made them rich. He didn't forget his brothers, either. Paolo, born in 1904, and Giuseppe, in 1908, were still back in Sicily when Carlo arrived. But the moment he could afford it, he sent for them. They didn't run rackets, they fronted them. Clean names, clean faces. Just enough separation to keep Carlo's name out of paperwork. But family blood wasn't the only currency he had. Gambino had paisans, men who knew his name before it meant anything, who knew his family from the old neighborhoods in Palermo. And chief among them was a childhood friend named Gaetano Lucchese. In New York, they called him Tommy. To a few, he was Tommy Brown. But to cops and reporters, he'd always be Three-Finger Brown, a name he hated. He lost the finger in a machine shop accident as a teenager. Before that, he was just another Sicilian kid in East Harlem, sweeping floors as a plumber's helper and grinding metal as an apprentice machinist. But when that blade took his index finger in 1919, it also took his patience for honest work. Then Prohibition hit. The saloons closed, the speakeasies opened, and the streets turned wet with money. Lucchese saw his chance. He joined a bootleg crew working out of East Harlem, one of the many outfits being pieced together by a rising Sicilian power broker, Salvatore Little Caesar Maranzano. Lucchese was already making moves when Gambino landed in America. In 1921, he got picked up driving a stolen car to a bootleggers' meet in eastern Long Island. It was a bad pinch. When they took him to the station in Riverhead, the cop on fingerprint duty, more comedian than cop, noticed the missing digit and jotted down Three-Finger Brown under aliases. The name, borrowed from a Chicago Cubs pitcher, stuck like a scar. Lucchese made bail, but the clock was ticking. He tried to bring Gambino into the Maranzano fold, an early favor from an old friend. But before anything could be cemented, the trial came. Lucchese went down for auto theft, 3 to 10 years. He served 3. While Tommy did his time, Gambino did what smart young men did. He adapted. He crossed the river into Brooklyn and attached himself to the real power in town. Giuseppe, Joe the Boss, Masseria. Brooklyn wasn't just a borough, it was a fortress. And Masseria's crew was the biggest in the city. At the top of that food chain was another Sicilian with heavy hands and heavier ambition. Salvatore Lucania, better known to his enemies, allies, and every police precinct in New York as Charlie Luciano. Gambino had landed in the middle of a storm, and he was learning how to ride the lightning. There were always obstacles on the road to the top. And for Carlo Gambino, 2 of those obstacles carried the same last name, Mangano. Philip Mangano and his older brother Vincent were more than just neighborhood toughs. They were embedded in the framework of Luciano's empire. Trusted lieutenants with deep Sicilian roots and a reputation that stretched from Brooklyn to Buffalo. They weren't just mobsters. They were architects of the American Mafia as it evolved in the shadow of Prohibition, and by the late 1950s, they were entrenched, respected, feared, and for Gambino, they were in the way. The Manganos weren't made in marble. They had scars. Both men came up in the smoke and fury of the 1920s, when gangsters were made by bullets, not ballots. They had been present during the building of the empire, and they had dirt under their nails to prove it. But rewind the clock just a little further, and things get murky. They didn't start as legends. They started as stick-up men, tied to crimes that made headlines before their names ever carried weight. Back in 1919, the Chicago Tribune published a chilling report. gang confesses to 31 crimes. Among those named in the sweep was a young Philip Mangano, connected to murders, armed robberies, saloon raids, and even a $34,000 bank messenger heist that shook Halsted Street. The names spilled onto the page like a roll call from a rogues gallery. Joseph Benkowski, Tony Santucci, Henry Bosch, Thomas Samario, Delos La Piana, and Mangano. They admitted to killing a saloon keeper, Eugene Mars, who had the bad luck to resist. That same night, they pulled 3 more stick-ups, then a bank job on South Halsted that netted over $1,000 in cash and another $1,700 in bonds. It was the kind of spree that marked them not just as criminals, but as professionals. And Philip Mangano had already found himself in the center of it. Then there was Buffalo. In 1924, another story emerged, this time from the Buffalo Courier Express. The name Di Carlo was on everyone's lips, a known bootlegger and underworld operator on trial for shooting a government witness. But it wasn't just Di Carlo in the frame. Behind the courtroom drama, whispers swirled about a bribery attempt, $1,500 offered to a railroad detective to alter testimony. The man refused. His story was backed by another witness. But the real twist came when 2 key names were quietly dropped from the defense: Joseph Spera and Philip Mangano. Both had been with Di Carlo the night of the shooting. Both were quietly taken into custody, and both, according to government agents, were told to stay away from the trial. Subpoenaed? Number material witnesses? Absolutely. And when the pressure came down, they vanished from the courtroom like ghosts. By then, the Mangano brothers had learned something vital. Survival wasn't just about muscle. It was about knowing when to disappear. And that made them dangerous. When Gambino began climbing through the ranks, the Manganos weren't just his elders. They were the gatekeepers. Trusted by Luciano, aligned with tradition, and connected deep into the Sicilian-American network, they represented the old guard. The mustache Petes, who still believed in ceremonies, in oaths spoken in dialect, in bosses who never showed their faces. But Gambino, he was part of the future. Quiet, calculating, Americanized. And he knew, if he wanted to become capo di tutti capi, the boss of bosses, he'd have to outlast them, or bury them. And soon enough, that moment would come. Trying to untangle what Carlo Gambino was up to in the months after he landed in New York is like trying to follow footsteps in a thunderstorm. The records are quiet, the memories are blurred. But if you looked close enough, if you followed the threads that wound through Brooklyn's underworld, you could see it. Gambino didn't just arrive. He entered a city that was already burning with opportunity, and he stepped into the smoke like he belonged there. At 21, he had none of the flash and all of the cunning. He didn't make noise. He didn't need to. The people he surrounded himself with said enough. Carlo Gambino came from a land steeped in blood and poppies. Sicily, rugged, sun-baked, and poor, had long been a cradle for narcotics. After the carnage of 2 world wars, opium was no longer just a commodity, it was salvation and currency. The mafiosi didn't just exploit the trade, they controlled the very roots of it. Through legitimate pharmaceutical fronts, they produced morphine and heroin under the guise of pain relief, flooding the market with white powder wrapped in medicine labels. By his early 20s, Gambino was already sniffing the wind and following the trail. He saw the empire before it had a name, and he tapped into it early, not with fanfare but quietly, methodically. He didn't build a narcotics empire overnight. It started small, just a trickle, hidden inside freight crates, slipped off the docks, or smuggled in with the human cargo that traffickers were moving in plain sight. He had a valuable link in this underworld supply chain, Joe Adonis. Adonis didn't walk into a room. He arrived. Immaculate suits, patent leather shoes, hair slicked back with military precision. But beneath the style was muscle and a mind built for the street. He was already making waves long before 1923, long before Luciano ever tasted his first cell block. That year, Luciano walked into a setup, a drug deal. He showed up in person to a deal set up by Vito Genovese, too confident, too visible, and the cops took him down. He later said the plan was simple: deliver the drugs to Adonis, who would cut them, repackage them, and pass them off to trusted distributors. But whispers said another name was in the mix that day, a quiet figure standing in the shadows. He didn't speak much, and he didn't need to. He watched. He listened. And while the spotlight burned on names like Charlie Luciano, Vito Genovese, and Joe Adonis, Carlo Gambino was just another face in the room. Unremarkable, forgettable. Exactly how he liked it. He wasn't face yet, not even close, but he was learning the map, street by street, dock by dock, handshake by handshake. This was the early 1920s, and the groundwork was being laid in whispers and back rooms. The real players were drawing lines in powder and blood, and Gambino, though barely mentioned, was there, picking up the crumbs that would one day lead to a throne. Joe Adonis, Frank Scalise, and Carlo Gambino were now closely tied to Lucky Luciano and held sway over the bootlegging circuits, pouring money into Lower Manhattan. With Prohibition in full swing, Adonis was swimming in narcotics and illegal liquor. He started looking for insulation. Guys like Luciano were already magnets for heat. What Adonis needed was protection, men who could move money, muscle, and silence. That man was Salvatore Spitale. Spitale wasn't the kind of name you'd find on a bakery box in Little Italy. He was a mover in the shadows, untouchable, elusive, and always one step ahead of the badge. His name came up in whispered conversations and police lineups. He wore his suits like armor and operated out of legitimate fronts, press offices, import companies, hotel lobbies, where nobody looked twice until somebody wound up dead. Together, Adonis and Spitale were more than bootleggers. They were businessmen in the purest underworld sense, diversified and lethal. Liquor was the front end. Narcotics was the core, heroin especially. Spitale had ties across the Catskills and through the hotel corridors of Manhattan, with narcotics flooding into back rooms and onto street corners. Gambino didn't just observe this empire. He found his place in it. While Adonis played the face and Spitale ran the logistics, Gambino learned, quietly, ruthlessly. He paid attention to what the cops missed, and what they couldn't prove. By 1928, Spitale's name was already making headlines, tied to one of the largest police raids in New York's memory. 14 men were arrested at 2 offices inside the Paramount building. Names on the doors read Mackenzie Press and Kenton Importing Company. But what they concealed was a pipeline of theft, murder for hire, and large-scale fencing. One of the victims had been a fur factory watchman named Harry Bunnis, gunned down trying to stop a $70,000 heist. Another was patrolman William Kelly, killed during a Brooklyn holdup. The cops were certain Spitale's crew had their fingerprints all over it. But certainty wasn't proof. The case collapsed in court. The men walked, and Spitale's name kept floating to the top. By 1930, he was named again, this time as one of the shooters in the attempted assassination of Jack Legs Diamond, a man whose criminal resume stretched from Manhattan brothels to Albany speakeasies. Spitale, according to police sources, was behind the hit. He and his partner in crime, Irving Bits, were running narcotics and eliminating problems. In 1931, the game turned bloody again. Federal narcotics agents started sniffing around Marion Kiki Roberts, a flame-haired dancer and Legs Diamond's lover. They suspected she was a junkie. Worse, they believed she was the bait, the one who led Diamond into the trap. According to agents, she was linked directly to Spitale and Bits. One source claimed Spitale made the phone call that lured Legs to the Monticello hotel the night he was shot 5 times. Others believed Kiki helped Spitale's gunman access Diamond's private stash of weapons, sawed-off shotguns hidden in his own arsenal. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was surgical. Spitale, always one step ahead, vanished before the indictments could find him. His fingerprints never landed on the evidence. His name was always there, but just out of reach. And through it all, Gambino was watching. He saw how Adonis kept his operation polished and insulated, how Spitale used violence like a tool, not an impulse. They weren't cowboys, they were planners. That was the education. Gambino learned that in this world, the smart ones didn't just survive, they built. With silence, with structure, with blood. And he was taking notes. By the fall of 1931, Marion Kiki Roberts, Broadway showgirl, red-haired beauty, and Legs Diamond's off-and-on companion, was front-page scandal, and police headache rolled into one. She surrendered in a swirl of headlines, waving off rumors that she had been murdered by gangsters or disappeared into the underworld. "I've just got one thing on my mind now," she told reporters. "To get a job in a show and prove how foolish all these charges are." She had been missing for 5 months. What she did not say, what no one ever said outright, was what she knew about the ambush at the Monticello hotel. Because by the time Legs Diamond was shot in the hallway outside her room, riddled with bullets and clinging to life, 2 names were already circling like vultures: Salvatore Salvi Spitale and Irving Blitzy Bits. Spitale had been a major player in the narcotics game, tied to heroin shipments, drugstore robberies, and whispered to be the man who quietly arranged hits to tie up loose ends. Bits was his shadow. A soft-spoken ex-con who blended into crowds but left blood in his wake. Together, they operated in the margins, off the books, but never off the radar. Police were convinced that the Monticello shooting was an inside job. Kiki said she was in the bath when it happened, but by the time the shooting stopped, Diamond was on the floor, bleeding out, and Spitale was already gone. Witnesses claimed he had a key to Kiki's room, and possibly even to Diamond's. The hotel was a fortress for Diamond. But somehow Spitale and Bits got in, fired 5 shots, and got out clean. It did not end there. Just months later, in April 1931, Diamond was gunned down again, this time at the Aratoga Inn in Cairo, New York. He was meeting with his crew to talk beer distribution when the shotguns came out. Buckshot tore through the windows and into Diamond's body. Again, he survived. Again, Kiki was by his side. And again, Spitale's name floated up from the gutters of whispered intelligence reports. By then, federal narcotics agents were closing in on Kiki too, calling her a user, a mule, a Delilah who sold out her own man. They accused her of signaling Spitale when Diamond was vulnerable, possibly even handing over the weapons used in the hit. And in the background, ever calm and composed, was Carlo Gambino, watching, listening, learning. He was not yet the man who would rule the 5 families, but he was taking notes. From the street corners of Brooklyn to the chaos in the Catskills, he saw how men like Spitale and Bits operated beneath the radar, how they built reputations through silence and controlled fear. Gambino was not looking to be flashy. He was looking to be permanent. Years later, when Spitale's name turned up again, this time tied to the Lindbergh kidnapping as a go-between between the underworld and law enforcement, it was clear how deep his reach went. And Bits? He had become something else entirely. By 1959, Irving Bits was no longer just a shadow. He had rebranded himself as a newsman, running Bronx County News Delivery and Bi-County News Corporation, strong-arming rival companies for contracts and operating under the same smooth, quiet menace that had defined him decades earlier. He now wore tailored suits, lived in Great Neck, and invoked the Fifth Amendment with the same ease others used to order coffee. Senate hearings called him a shadowy kingfish. His name came up in connection to rackets with Tony Bender-Strollo, Daniel Zwilman, and others with bloodied legacies. Bits had been convicted for running the biggest illegal lottery operation in New York, had narcotics charges, a gun conviction, and a homicide arrest on his record, and still managed to collect over $50,000 a year in legitimate business income while pressuring Newsday for distribution deals through hired muscle. Back in the early 1920s, they were all climbing together: Luciano, Genovese, Adonis, even Spitale and Bits. It was a brotherhood built on blood, hustle, and ambition. They helped each other rise, forming alliances in back rooms and on street corners, bonds that for some would stretch across decades. But time has a way of thinning the herd. Gambino outlasted them all. Joe Adonis, charming, dangerous, a star in his own right, was deported in the mid-1950s, forced to vanish into exile while his empire dissolved behind him. Bits and Spitale? Their names faded into police files and tragic anecdotes. But Carlo Gambino, he survived. Not because he was louder, because he was smarter. He didn't need flash, he didn't strut. He didn't leave bodies in hotel hallways or get caught in the fallout of a dancer's betrayal. He let the others chase fame while he chased power. He played the long game, every move deliberate, every risk calculated. Where others burned hot and fast, Gambino moved like smoke through a keyhole, quiet, unstoppable. By the time the dust settled, only a few were left standing, and one of them was Gambino. It was through Joe Adonis, handsome, polished, and dangerous, that Lucky Luciano expanded his reach deep into Brooklyn's underworld. Adonis wasn't just another lieutenant. He was a bridge, a trusted fixer who moved between boroughs and between families, always knowing who to court and who to eliminate. And through him, Luciano secured the loyalty of Francesco Cheech Scalise. Scalise was pure Sicilian, tough, street-smart, and quietly influential among the Brooklyn crews. He became Luciano's eyes and ears on the other side of the East River. But Scalise offered more than just insight. He offered talent. That talent was a wiry young soldier named Carlo Gambino. Gambino didn't show up with flash or noise. He wasn't the kind of guy you remembered for his suits or his mouth. But Scalise saw something in him, a quiet calculation, a readiness to follow orders, and a mind already wired for power. Gambino didn't need to be taught how the game worked. He understood it instinctively. Luciano took notice. "Someday," he told a friend in 1961, "Gambino's going to run the whole outfit in the United States." It wasn't a prediction. It was a prophecy. Brooklyn had become more than just a hub for bootlegging and bookmaking. It was producing killers, earners, and visionaries. And one of them had just returned from Sing Sing, free, angry, and ready to prove himself. His name was Albert Anastasia. The court records listed him as Anastasio, but that name had been quietly changed, an effort to protect his family from the shame of what he'd become. Murder charges overturned. Witnesses who couldn't be found. Evidence that evaporated. When Anastasia walked free, it was as if death row had spit him out, and Luciano was waiting. From the first meeting, there was a bond. Anastasia didn't hide his loyalty. He wore it. He looked at Luciano like a savior, a brother, a boss. And Luciano saw in him a weapon, a man who didn't flinch, didn't question, and didn't blink when it was time to kill. "You know, Charlie," Anastasia once said, half laughing, "I betcha I'm the only loud-mouthed bum you really like." He wasn't wrong. Short, broad-shouldered, and built like a steel trap. Anastasia didn't just commit violence, he embodied it. He could kill in cold blood or out of boredom. It made no difference to him, and that made him invaluable. He wasn't just muscle, he was execution. Gambino watched from a distance. He learned from men like Anastasia, not just how to survive, but how to move in silence while others drew fire. He understood that power didn't always come with noise. Sometimes it came with patience, and the pieces were starting to move. In 1924, he wasn't yet the Lord High Executioner, the feared overlord of Murder Inc. He was just another hard hitter from Brooklyn, trying to survive in a world where grudges were permanent and bullets were currency. On a sweltering afternoon in Red Hook, Anastasia and an associate named Biagio Giordano were cruising down Sackett Street in a beat-up sedan when all hell broke loose. From the ground floor windows of a nearby tenement, gunfire erupted. The first shots came fast, explosions of thunder and smoke from a revolver and a rifle. It was an ambush, clean and calculated. The kind of hit that didn't leave much to chance. People screamed, metal twisted, blood painted the seats. Anastasia caught a shotgun blast to his left side, buckshot tearing into his ribs. Giordano was hit 4 times, 3 rounds to the hip, another to the shoulder. The car barely coasted to a stop before crashing against the curb. The shooters vanished just as quickly, slipping through the back of another building like ghosts. The police arrived to find chaos, shell casings, bloodstains, and 2 barely breathing men slumped in the wreckage. They also found a rifle and a revolver left behind in the building. But when they turned to the crowd, over 200 witnesses, neighbors, shopkeepers, passers-by, not one had seen a thing. Omertà had already sealed the neighborhood shut. The police chalked it up to a gangland feud. They tied it to an old murder from 1919, a restaurant man named Charles Cicero, gunned down just blocks from the scene of this latest shootout. Anastasia was eventually charged in the case, but the conviction didn't stick. He fought it, won a retrial, and the charges were tossed by the Supreme Court. He walked free, bloodied, but not broken. At just 26 years old, Anastasia had already learned one of the golden rules of Cosa Nostra. If you're going to get shot, make sure you live long enough to shoot back. And in the years to come, he would, side by side with Gambino. The family tree of organized crime in America didn't grow straight. It twisted, branching out not just along ethnic lines, but along the sharp instincts of men who knew opportunity when they saw it. Luciano was Italian, sure, but that never stopped him from doing business with Jews, Irish, even crooked cops and crooked politicians, anyone who could push the machine forward. It was Meyer Lansky who brought Louis Buchalter, a thick-necked Jewish racketeer already carving out a violent name for himself in the garment center, into their circle. The meeting happened in the private back rooms of the Claridge Hotel, a place that functioned as Luciano's unofficial headquarters. When Buchalter walked in, Luciano's first impression wasn't glowing. "I took one look at him," Lucky would later recall, "and all I saw was a fat face, big head, and muscles bulging out of his sleeves. Something told me this guy was all strong-arm, no brains." Still, before Luciano could even finish his thought, Buchalter cut in with a soft smile. "You can call me Lepke," he said. Lucky blinked, then laughed. "What the fuck kind of name is that?" Embarrassed, Lepke explained. "Lepkele, a childhood nickname from his mother." That broke the ice. "How can you not like a guy who always thinks about his mother?" Lucky shrugged. Luciano didn't trust Lepke's intelligence, but he respected his ambition. And, most importantly, he saw Lepke's value. He had the manpower, he had the muscle, and he had the territory, control over swaths of New York's garment district, where hundreds of small shops could be squeezed for protection. He just didn't have structure. Luciano, Lansky, and the others laid it out for him. A blueprint. Start small, secure the weaker shops, dominate them, use them as leverage to move on the tougher outfits. Make the racket into a business. Use old tools, arson, acid, dynamite, but use them surgically. Lepka bought in. With that handshake, Luciano gained a vital foothold in the garment center, and a long arm into labor, distribution, and political influence that would grow like a tumor beneath the surface of the city. Then came Frank Costello, who brought in another Jewish powerhouse, Arthur Flegenheimer, better known as Dutch Schultz. Dutch ruled the Bronx like a medieval king, brutal, ambitious, and flush with bootlegging profits. When Costello first floated Dutch's name at a Claridge meeting, Vito Genovese exploded. "What the hell is this? What are you trying to do? Load us up with a bunch of Hebes." Before Lansky or Benny Siegel could react, Costello stood up, eyes cold. "Take it easy, Don Vitone. You're nothing but a fucking foreigner yourself." That moment was a crack of thunder across the table. From then on, Don Vitone became a nickname whispered behind Genovese's back, or occasionally to his face, by the brave. He never forgot it, and he never forgave Frank Costello. Still, business was business. Despite the outburst, Luciano and Schultz struck a deal, an alliance of equals, each ruling his own domain, neither stepping on the other's toes. Prohibition was the great equalizer. Liquor didn't care what your last name was, and neither did it profit. Luciano and Lansky didn't stop there. In New Jersey, they forged another pact, this time with Abner Longy Zwilman, a soft-spoken book-reading bootlegger with eyes on respectability, and his polar opposite, Willie Moretti, a woman-chasing enforcer whose mouth eventually ran faster than his brain. Zwilman dated Jean Harlow. Moretti ended up with syphilitic brain damage. One sought status, the other found bullets. And behind all of this, the quiet architect, the real godfather of modern crime, was Arnold Rothstein. Rothstein wasn't just a gambler. He was a professor of power. He taught Luciano how to dress, how to use a fork, how to treat a woman in public. He taught etiquette the same way he taught strategy, through example. He gave Waxy Gordon his start. He laid the groundwork for smuggling operations with Scottish distilleries, securing legit contracts and paying deposits to ensure deliveries. Then he passed the distribution torch to Gordon, on one condition. Luciano got first crack at the product. "I bought every drop," Lucky said. Rothstein didn't just teach class. He moved money. He lived fast, burned through fortunes, and when he died, shot at the Park Central Hotel on November 4th, 1928, the streets whispered, it was over a bad bet. The cops brought in Luciano for questioning, but he played it cool. "I never knew who it did," he said. By then, Rothstein's lessons had already taken root. With liquor flowing in from Canada, much of it supplied by Samuel Bronfman, the future head of Seagram's, the problem wasn't supply. It was logistics. Trucks broke down. Roads were dangerous. Other mobs hijacked cargo. The losses were real. So Luciano and his partners got smart. If you couldn't get enough uncut whiskey, make your own. Not fake, but close. Use good grain alcohol, cut the real stuff, rebottle it, and flood the market. Philadelphia was ideal, Waxy Gordon's backyard. It had distilleries turning out legal alcohol under the Volstead loophole. The government said booze could be consumed for medicinal reasons, so certain companies got licenses to make the product. The mob made them partners, or buried them. That was just step one. They went into bottling, then printing, for labels identical to Johnny Walker, Haig and Haig, Dewars, then warehousing, trucking, real estate. They built an ecosystem, and none of it was legit, but every piece worked like a corporation. A dangerous, perfectly oiled, mob-run corporation. "We had a bigger company than Henry Ford," Lucky would later boast. "Only difference was our guys had a drive good and shoot straight." The drivers were armed. The bookkeepers had photographic memories. Most numbers never made it to paper. Lansky watched the accounts like a hawk. Lawyers were on retainer 24/7. And the muscle. That was the part nobody had to ask about. We had exporters, importers, all kinds of help a corporation needs. Only we had more. That was the irony. The same brilliance that could have built a Wall Street empire was used to build a criminal one instead. But Lucky didn't regret it. I could have been legit, he once said, but I wouldn't have enjoyed it like what I was doing. Carlo Gambino didn't come to America looking for headlines. He came to build something that would last. In the Prohibition era, when bootleggers were printing cash with every barrel of liquor, Gambino slid into the machine like a cog that had always been there. Quiet, observant, purposeful. Assigned to Joe Masseria's alcohol racket almost immediately, he began learning the business not from behind a desk, but from the wheels up. Transportation came first. This wasn't just about smuggling bottles. It was about understanding the fleet. What kind of engines could outrun the cops? What kind of trucks could carry weight without breaking down? How much it cost to keep men on the road, and what those men risked every night. He studied the routes, the maintenance schedules, the gas costs, and the grease money to keep the traffic cops looking the other way. Next came distribution. That was the bloodline. If the booze sat too long, it turned from money into a liability. Warehouses were targets. Every day it sat was a day closer to a hijacking. The trick was to have buyers lined up before the liquor even crossed the city line, and Gambino knew how to talk to buyers. He was soft-spoken, always polite, always respectful. In a world of hotheads and muscle, Carlo Gambino was a breath of cold, clean air. Luciano didn't want to get too close to Brooklyn. It was chaotic, fractured, too many moving parts. Gambino made it his turf. He carved his name quietly into the borough, block by block, customer by customer. No headlines, nobody count, just business. While Frank Costello was building international smuggling lines for alcohol, Gambino was studying those same routes with a different eye. He saw how they could be used for narcotics and human trafficking. He watched ships dock, studied customs schedules, listened when Costello or Frank Scalise explained how to angle the Coast Guard, how to anchor offshore and run room fleets through shadow ports. These were dangerous channels, but they taught him everything: the timing, the risk, the reward. He was learning from men who understood legacy. Costello was a master of politics. Luciano was an architect of alliances. Scalise, Adonis, and others showed Gambino how to handle hijackers, how to gather information, and how to move fast without getting noticed. If a truck got hit, it was Carlo who was sent in to get it back. Sometimes he rolled with Luciano himself, not because he was the strongest, but because he could think like the enemy and never had to raise his voice to be heard. He didn't threaten. He promised. And that made him dangerous. In a room full of killers, Gambino came off like an accountant, soft-spoken, almost shy, with a polite smile and folded hands. You wanted to trust him. You did trust him. And that was the trap. Because beneath that calm exterior was a mind built for power, calculated, cautious, lethal when it had to be. He didn't wear pinky rings or shout orders. He whispered. And things got done. Gambino wasn't there to impress. He was there to outlast. He pledged loyalty to the Castellano family and began weaving himself into the structure. He helped build networks that stretched from docks to courtrooms, from speakeasies to City Hall. And he never took credit. He didn't need to. The people who mattered already knew who he was. Like Luciano, Gambino believed in alliances. He believed in subtlety. And like Luciano, he saw the value of crossing ethnic lines. He had grown up Sicilian, taught to hate outsiders, Jews, Irish, anyone not from his village. But in Brooklyn's back alleys, poverty didn't care what language you spoke or what god you prayed to. In those neighborhoods, everyone hustled, everyone suffered, and everyone bled the same. Gambino shook hands with the people he'd once been taught to see as enemies, and they reached back, because even gangsters recognized quality. One of those connections may have been made long before New York. Tommy Lucchese, born just months apart from Gambino in Palermo, Sicily. Some say they knew each other back home. Others claim they crossed paths for the first time in America. What's clear is that when Gambino arrived, Lucchese was already carving out his piece of the world under Maranzano's umbrella, and the two men forged a bond that would last decades. Like Luciano and Costello, they played both sides, building bridges while others burned them. And Gambino? He kept learning, kept moving, and never raised his voice.